Hi, this is Charles Hoskinson broadcasting live from warm, sunny Colorado. Always warm, always sunny, sometimes Colorado. Today is March 4th, 2024, and I'm making a bookend video to complement the other video I made, I think it was a few weeks or a few months ago, discussing the Supreme Court reviewing whether Trump could be on the ballot or not. So, as you know, I'm rule of law type of guy. And generally speaking, I like objective standards that are applied across the board equally to all people. In some cases, that disadvantages a political party like the Republicans. In other cases, that disadvantages a political party like the Democrats. But it's bipartisan in that there should be equal application of the law. Now, when I made that prior video, I said if the court is nonpartisan in this, it should be 9-0, no dissent. That it's unlawful for a state to arbitrarily decide to remove someone from the ballot without citing some form of federal standard. Now, of course, people who hate Trump came in and said, well, that's a terrible thing. And Colorado can do whatever it wants. And Maine did something. I guess Illinois also did that. So now we have a ruling from the Supreme Court, hot off the press, 9-0. So it was nonpartisan. Trump versus Anderson. And this right here basically outlines the case and what's been discussed and what the Supreme Court of Colorado was talking about and all the different arguments. And on page 6, you have down here, the case raises the question whether states, in addition to Congress, may also enforce Section 3. We conclude that states may disqualify persons holding or attempting to hold state office, but states have no power under the Constitution to enforce Section 3 with respect to federal offices, especially the presidency. And it goes down and says, hey, hang on a second here. Such power over governance, however, does not extend to federal office holders and candidates because federal offices, quote, owe their existence and function to the united voice of the whole, not of a portion of the people. Powers over election and their qualifications must be specifically delegated to rather than reserved by the states. 9-0, not controversial. So if you're curious about what is the standard for insurrection, it's never really been formally established, but we do have 3 different ways to look at it. One is the U.S. Code. So if you look at Chapter 115, is treason, sedition, and subversion activities. And in particular, Section 2383 has a rebellion and insurrection clause. Whoever incites, sets foot, assists, or engages in any rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States or laws thereof, or gives aid or comfort thereto, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 10 years or both, and shall be incapable of holding any office under the United States. As of June 25th, 1948, and then revised September 13, 1994. Okay, so this is actually in the code, which means you can be tried and convicted and arrested of it. That is one standard. Another standard is impeachment and removal from office. Seems to be some precedent there that if you're removed for insurrection, meaning you're impeached and removed, probably the case that the 14th Amendment would apply, which was actually Nancy Pelosi's reason when she was trying to impeach and remove Trump from office, that he would be ineligible for seeking office. He was impeached, but not removed. And the third seems to be the old Confederate standard, where you actually send a formal letter to the United States saying, hey, I've resigned and joined an opposing faction, and we're actually building our own country, and I guess we're at war with each other. Kind of a good indication of insurrection and sedition, these types of things, when you physically take up arms and engage in active war. Those are the 3 standards that exist. One is judicial, one's a political process through the legislative branch, and the other one's an actual war that you fight, and a formal notice that you send that you are no longer part of the Union. You formed your own nation, and you've voluntarily left. None of those were met with January 6th. I know you might watch MSNBC and CNN a lot and think that that was the case, but actually didn't occur. Wasn't removed, thus not convicted, and wasn't convicted in a court of law. And we have the right to due process, which is why We're now in a situation where the Supreme Court reminds everybody of this. But it's a broader and more important global question of what makes good laws and what makes good constitutions and what makes good rights. Generally speaking, when people can abuse the law in order to achieve a political end, silencing an opponent, arresting their opponents, preventing people from being able to express their voice or will, there's some form of structural defect in the law. So an example, if we write a poor constitution for Cardano, would be something like, hey, I can just use the DREPs and take all your money. Or I can just use the DREPs and basically make certain ADA ineligible to vote, just without any due process, just simple majority vote. Technically speaking, if the governance system is designed incorrectly, it would have the power to do that. And so as we write the Constitution of Cardano, these types of cases are important because there can be legitimate grievances. I fully appreciate that there are many people in the United States who subscribe to the belief that January 6th was the worst thing that happened since the Civil War, Trump committed insurrection, is an existential threat to the continuity of all of the institutions of the United States and must be stopped at any cost with any means. I fully appreciate that. Now, if you hold that view, then today is a loss and you think it's a bad day for democracy. If you hold the view that we're a constitutional republic and we have equal protection under the law, regardless of how odious the person happens to be, today is a victory for the republic. Just depends on your viewpoint. And the Constitution is there, and you have arbitrators whose job is to interpret it. And this was a pretty straightforward interpretation. And if it wasn't, it would be 6-3 with the justices appointed by Obama and Biden voting in the dissent. Instead, it's 9-0. It's 9-0. It's not controversial. It's a very clear and cut matter of law that the federal government gets to decide this, not the states, or else it's chaos. And there exists at least 3 good standards you could point to say that disqualifies, and none of them have been satisfied in this case. So it makes no sense to move forward. We will run into very similar analogous situations with respect to one's rights with ADA. It's not as consequential as who gets to be the president of the United States, but it is in how you use the network and what you do. And so it really is important that we have to converge to some basic principles as an ecosystem and think through how do we get better outcomes. For example, in a lot of discussions in polling during the aftermath of January 6th, privately, many Republican senators said that had they been able to vote anonymously, they actually would have voted to remove Trump from office. And they had personal disgust and very nasty feelings towards the president. So in that particular case, the ballot architecture mattered for the outcome. They saw what happened to Liz Cheney. They saw what happened to Mitt Romney, and they realized that the politics at the retail level prevented them from voting their conscience. But had they not suffered that consequence, they actually would have removed him from office and actually would have never had this Supreme Court case. So then you have to think, okay, well, are there cases in the enforcement of rights where an anonymous ballot makes sense? You can verify they're a member of the set, like a DREP or a constitutional committee member. Or you could, but you don't necessarily have to reveal which ones voted. It's currently not in SIP 1694, but future versions of the governance structure could include that. And certainly people could build smart contracts to facilitate this matter using complex cryptography, especially the nature of what midnight brings to bear. You also consider other things. Many people in the UK cite that had Brexit had multiple ballots instead of a single referendum, the probability of it passing, especially if people realize the consequences of it, would diminish greatly. But because they only had one big vote, it's able to sneak through, and then people learn the consequences at a later date, in which case they said, maybe I didn't really think that one fully through. So maybe for very controversial things, you want to have multiple votes and give people time to understand the consequences of those votes, just to be double extra sure that they're moving in the right direction. So these are the teachable moments, and one can look at them. And I'm not advocating one way or the other way. All I do is I advocate for equal protections of the law, equal application of the law, and that each and every person, regardless of that person, whether they're a saint or a sinner, is treated the same. I think that's a very foundational principle of a constitutional republic and a constitutional derived protocol. And I hope that we can converge in that particular direction. In my experience, anytime we violate the rule of law, everything goes to hell. I'll tell you guys a story that I seldom talk about publicly. So a few years back, we were invited to El Salvador. And at the time, we were invited to bid on and were given soft assurances that IO could lead a consortium of companies to implement the Shivo wallet and implement the Bitcoin implementation for El Salvador. So I flew down to San Salvador with a delegation, including Alpha Point's CEO and a lot of our executives and people, and we spent some time directly engaging with the El Salvadoran government, including Bukele directly. Now, we made best effort to try to figure out how to put all these things together. And I eventually came to the determination that the institutions of El Salvador were simply not strong enough for a private company to do a job of this nature, because in the event that we ran into a disagreement with the government, there was no recourse or ability for us to get fair consideration. So we actually ended up passing on that deal, which was one of the hardest decisions I had to make as a CEO. I'd spent years of my career saying, crypto's finally made it when nation states take it seriously. And to be sitting in the presidential palace in El Salvador and have an opportunity to be part of that history was incredibly tempting. But I always try to operate with integrity and principles. And when we looked at the deal and we realized that the courts in the legislative branch were not strong enough to overcome the influence of a very powerful and charismatic executive branch, it just made no sense to go down that road because it could become long-term more harmful than good. Of course, there's no ill will or hard feelings. Alpha Point stayed and continued working on that deal, as have others come in afterwards. And obviously, El Salvador is doing its thing, and it's exciting to see what they do with it. But it just shows you a bit about my philosophy and how I think about things. I'm a rule of law guy, and I'm a person that believes very firmly in natural rights and constitutional protections, checks and balances, and the ability to reverse bad decisions or at least question them. The next 9 months in Cardano's history are going to be the most pivotal and most important in the history of the project, because these are the months that an on-chain government will wake up and you, the people of Cardano, take your rightful role in place in running that on-chain government end to end. Every single thing can be debated, discussed, and hypothetically changed should you, the people of Cardano, choose to do that. You're moving, in many cases, from passive spectators to active participants, and your opinions now can become full reality, for better or for worse. If we do a good job building our institutions, our constitutional protections, and we do a good job building the systems to ensure that there's efficacy, efficiency, and integrity, I firmly believe that Cardano will be the most powerful, pervasive, and significant ecosystem ever derived in the cryptocurrency space. And why wouldn't we be? Because our competitors do not give the participants a voice, a say, and the ability to rise to any level of power. They're just simply anarchistic protocols or cults of personality around certain founders. But they do not try to be by the people, for the people, and be there as a mechanism to enhance and grow from the wisdom and brilliance of the community as a whole. This is a huge challenge, and it is a risk, but I'm always an optimist. I believe things are always better when they're transparent, when they're growing, and we get to the right place. So we're on the dawn of SIP 1694. In a few short months, the SPOs will be making that decision whether we should fork or not. And after that happens, if it happens, there will be DREPs registering, and in short order afterwards, a constitutional convention, which will lay the foundations for Cardano's future decades to centuries to come, making it an eternal protocol. We'll be with you every step of the way and have strong opinions every step of the way. But just like that example in El Salvador, it's insanely important to have institutions that act as counterbalances, or else you cannot safely do this. Because even if in the short term it works well, in the long term it seldom does. And we've seen this time and again. What happened today in America is an example of institutions pushing back and trying to return us to a reset of integrity. Now we get to decide at the ballot box in a fair election what the philosophy of the nation should be, instead of people we didn't elect and have nothing to do with deciding that on our behalf. We, the people, are in charge. That's a good thing, in my view. And I hope that we can accommodate the same principles here in Cardano and have checks and balances, regardless of how odious particular people may be or how much we disagree with particular people. And that should be a universal concern. It's also an opportunity for us to innovate and ask, how do we get to controversial decisions? How do we get to cults of personality? How do we get to bad decisions being made, or decisions being made that benefit the few at the expense of the many? Another thing that IO is going to do, in addition to helping shepherd and steward a process, is also make proposals about foundational research you, the community, can approve. And those proposals will relate to improvements of the voting systems in general, to make them more inclusive, to go beyond just voting with ADA, but also other resources as well. Minotaur is the beginning of that process, and also different voting systems together, like linear preference ordering and quadratic voting, that can be implemented in future versions of on-chain governance to correct agency failures and issues that people, very rightfully so, have pointed out in the past, or theoretical concerns which could become actual concerns with enough participation. This is one of several voices that are getting louder and louder, and there's going to be a lot of people in the community, now that the Treasury is opening up, who will do exactly the same, and rightfully so. The synthesis of these ideas, the melting pot of these ideas, I very firmly believe will result in the most advanced and successful governing system ever conceived. It's important to understand and take a moment to ask, what is a good governing system? The problem is, in America, we don't have one. We are told time and again by the people who run the show, who in the shadows have united together and agreed on some fundamental principles, that the effective governing system is firing the people of the opposing party. So if you're a Democrat, as long as Republicans are out of power, the government works. And if you're a Republican, as long as the Democrats are out of power, the government works. But what exactly does works mean? By any objective measurement, our government is a failure. The approval rating of the legislative branch is 18%. Yet 96% of the incumbents are reelected every 2 years to 6 years, depending upon whether it's the Congress or the Senate. By every objective metric, the quality of life and standard of living of the middle class and poor in the United States has been steadily deteriorating due to inflation for more than 25 years. And every generation is having a harder time doing the foundational things that the prior generation did. You have to look no further than to the popular show The Simpsons. I remember when I was a kid, it's a show about an uneducated blue-collar worker who somehow, despite the fact that he has a blue-collar job, was able to have a stay-at-home wife, 3 kids, a house, and 2 cars, and was able to pay the bills, and they seem to be living comfortably in a middle-class life. Today, right now, for Gen Z, you can have a married couple, both attend college, have advanced degrees, and they can barely afford to make rent at an apartment and pay their bills and student loans. That's reality. Tens of millions of Americans suffer. And these are not necessarily bad jobs. They could be programmers, they could be engineers, they could be even professionals like lawyers and doctors. It's a truly extraordinary thing. And that's because of inflation, which is rampant. We have more than $30 trillion in debt in the United States. The USA debt clock tracks it real time. The price of that debt is now so significant, it's more than the entire military-industrial complex, just the interest rate in the United States, every single year. No value to the taxpayers, no value to our people. That is our reality today. The world is less peaceful today than it was 25 years ago. We have millions more homeless and people in poverty today than we did 25 years ago. We have a terrible problem with undocumented immigrants, over 23 million in the country, with no clear resolution. Our healthcare system is significantly more expensive and difficult to engage with, despite the fact of miracles of technological renaissance. It was easier to get good healthcare in the time of my grandfather when he started practicing medicine in the late 1950s than it is in 2023 in an age of the iPhone and the internet and AI. It's an extraordinary statement, but that's the reality we live in. You can't look anywhere in the United States and say the metrics are meaningfully better or improving, but we don't talk about them. Constitutional republics that follow the Lockean notion that the government is a trust and you are the beneficiary have a moral and fiduciary obligation to the people who pay in and endow them with power to report on the welfare and state of the nation and to give an honest appraisal of whether metrics are moving in the right direction or not. Cardano will be no different. An effective, efficient, and high-integrity government has to be really good at objectively looking at the health of Cardano as a network. Are things such as transactions getting faster, cheaper, and easier to do? Are our capabilities growing? Is the overall throughput capacity of the network increasing? Do you feel like you're getting more inclusive? Are there more dApps being built? Are there more applications? Are there more community events or less? And is the system getting more decentralized or not? One of the priorities we laid out was to create indexes that are objective and neutral, such as the Edinburgh Decentralization Index, where we gave grants to scientists to pursue first principles research and come up with 8 different parameters to measure decentralization, and do so across the board, across the industry, to start a conversation about what is decentralization and what's the most effective way to measure it. This is a versioned product, meaning the first version is not going to be perfect, but through debate and collaboration, future versions of this will eventually converge to a industry-accepted measurement of decentralization. Then you, the citizens of Cardano, can look at it and ask yourself, are you comfortable with the number you're looking at, or can we do better? And administrations that are elected, efforts that are initiated, protocols that are embraced can always be scored against that fundamental metric. And we can look year after year and say, are things improving? That which you measure, you can improve. That which you don't, you can't. That's an axiom of business and of governance. We also will need metrics to represent the egalitarianism of the system in terms of people's access and say, the performance of the system, and something to represent the fundamental value of protocols. Not the price of ADA, but something more macroeconomic and global, which is actually one of the missions of XC, John Ford's venture. So my hope is through Intersect in the community in the coming months and years, we can come up with these metrics, agree to them, and then come up with a vision and agenda as a community about what needs to be done to improve them and measure them. And if they don't improve, fire the people held accountable for it and be able to replace them with people who can, just like any good business or any good governing structure could do so. Our government is a failure if we don't have that right. If we look at the legislative branch of the United States, despite the fact they have 18% approval rating and they can't pass laws, we can't fire them. 96% keep their job. I, in my life, have never seen an institution in such low regard that seems to still preserve and protect its monopoly on power. That's an example of an inefficient, ineffective body. And that means such a thing has to be reformed, and it's unwilling or unable to reform itself. So if the same result happens in Cardano, that's an example of an ineffective, inefficient governing structure, and we will have failed in the implementation of on-chain governance. If we can get beyond that, which I do believe we can, and we have the right North Stars, the right metrics to measure, Not only will we never converge to that, we will develop governing structures that are vastly superior to corporate governance and to nation-state governance, and serve as a beacon for the entire world about how one should structure their business and also how one should preserve and protect human rights. In essence, Cardano becomes the sandbox for what we originally tried to accomplish in the 18th century with the American dream. Preserve and protect the freedom and liberty of all and their property. So it's a great experiment, and it's the biggest of my career and lifetime. And I hope that you can see that this is not just simply an upgrade. This is really something that the world as a whole can watch. And somehow, some way, we're going to get through it. The coming months are going to be tough. There's a lot of debates, a lot of work to do. You're already doing it. There was a great group that came together and conducted a governance attack on SanchoNet, tried to break it. We're proud of that. It's important. Every action, whether it be CE Explorer showing the governance actions to discussions about parameters, no matter how big or small, they matter because they're cumulative, and because they're cumulative, will add up to a much greater whole that has the emergent property of being functional. Many of you listening are considering becoming DREPs, and you're just waiting for an opportunity to learn more and do how. And we as a community have to do a great job of making sure all those who want to serve have an opportunity to try. And based upon the merit and persuasion, some will succeed. As we close out the year and we write a constitution, my hope is to apply the best available principles and technology and the will of the community as a whole. In terms of the Constitutional Convention, one of the things that we're aspiring to, and I'll be donating money for, is to hold workshops across the world. IO is committed to holding at least 50 in 50 different countries. We will pay for those as a donation to the community. And our belief is that those workshops can go through and talk about what makes a good constitution, take a look at some reference material, and then mark it up and vote on a delegate to travel to Argentina, where the Constitutional Convention is being held. We hope other institutions, such as the Foundation and Emergo, also subsidize more workshops so we can go from 50 countries to 100, maybe even 150, and make a Constitutional Convention as representative as possible for the entire world. And just like the U.S. Constitutional Convention, hold a very high threshold to pass through. Should one be ratified there, SIP 1694 provides a mechanism for the entirety of the community to review and approve the Constitution through a tripartite vote. Should we get there, we've just shown the world how to bring the world together and pass a Constitution, one that preserves and protects the liberty of all users of a system and provides the foundations required for rule of law so that each and every person, regardless of where they're born, who they are, where they're from, their philosophy, their opinion, their sexuality, their gender, has protection. It's 2024. Humanity deserves to move beyond the dark ages. We deserve to move beyond philosophies and conceptions and biases that have plagued us for so very long. The magic and power of blockchain is it's the crutch that gives us integrity when we lack it personally. It's the magic mirror that when we look in it, always tells us the truth of who we really are. And no matter how virtuous and capable, each and every one of us has some form of flaw. The power of blockchain is it doesn't care or judge us for those flaws. Its job is to protect us from them, remind us of them, and give us a path to eschew them so that we can get to a higher ground and trust each other again. I don't want to live in a world where we hate each other, distrust each other, and every action we take is some form of defense against our neighbor. I'll close with this. There's two ways you can live life. Imagine you're a rancher and your next door neighbor's got a little lot of land, and you know him, you grew up with him, and he's having a hard time and you want that lot of land. So you go over and say, hey, I'd like to buy it from you. Now, if we live in a world with trust and camaraderie, that's an easy deal. You shake on it, you agree to a number. And if there's some stuff that comes up, you have enough trust in the relationship to be able to fix it on the back end, and you don't have to worry too much about it. It's not very stressful, and it's an easy thing to do, and both parties benefited a lot. The world without trust means that transaction can't happen. That transaction requires lawyers, lots of work, aggressive discussions, tough negotiations. And at the end of the day, the outcome is the same: an exchange of money for land. Blockchain is that middleman that makes the first reality much easier for us all. And we get the same protections as if we had those lawyers, as if we had those aggressive defensive measures. And if we can get back to a world where we can trust each other again, we can get back to a world where we can love each other again and have integrity and stop hating and stop fighting and stop being aggressive. And we can get back to a world where maybe, just maybe, we can develop some wisdom and reason. So that's why I'm here. That's why many of you are here. And I can't wait to see what we produce this year. The world is watching us. Thank you.